Welcome to our webinar series for professionals.
Hi everyone, Thursday, 30th of November, and it's going to be in the sign of the baby, the healthy baby, the healthy pregnancy. Grow baby today is the topic. And last time we had Dr. Leslie and Emily Rydbom on the scene here. It was back in 20, I think, where they introduced Grow Baby the first time, and lots of things has happened since Grow Baby was launched, both in regards to their research and clinical knowledge around both working with the test, but also gathering data on all the people and pregnant women and babies that have been through their program. So those are some of the things that they are going to allude to today. And it's so nice having Dr. Leslie Stones and Emily Rydbom, mother and daughter team here, which is amazing, feeling the energy between the two of you, like, oh, can you just do this, and can you do this slide, and it's so nice to see the energy around it. So just very quickly, I think this is the last webinar this year that we will be holding, and then we will come back in January for sure, and we will send out invites for all the webinars that we will attend, just like we normally do. So yeah, Christmas is coming up, and yeah, I thought we get less attendees around closer we get to Christmas. So I thought that was kind of the idea, just so that you're prepared for that. And then, of course, Dr. Leslie Stones has been delivering babies since 1982, from what I've understood, and she has delivered over 5,000 children.
So, and counting.
And counting, exactly, yeah, yeah. And Emily Rydbom is all about nutrition and lifestyle allocations in regards to a healthy conception, but also a healthy pregnancy. So it's a great group of the two of you working together with us on the genetic side and creating Grow Baby. And of course, our Helen Gauci has been involved in the development as well. And also remember, if you haven't already got the Grow Baby education, where it's more in-depth around the specific SNPs, etc., then reach out. It's on our website. You go into your VMS account and you can find it under education. There's a link to education, further education up in the top, where you can sign up for that and get more in-depth knowledge as what to do on the different SNPs. But I'm sure you will learn something here. And having said that, I will then mute myself, but remember to put questions in the chat box. I'll take note of them, and then at the end, we'll do a Q&A between these beautiful stars and myself. So hang in there, and I will mute myself, and then I will, of course, guide you if you need any support, Emily and Leslie, to, with the technique.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, Anne Catherine. Here we go. So it's a wonderful opportunity that we are able, Emily and I are able to speak to you today. We've just come to a near conclusion to an application of a targeted nutrition and lifestyle program that has been enhanced by our collaboration with dnalife. Together, in a fantastic collaboration, we've been able to put together a set of single nucleotide polymorphisms that has optimized our outcomes. We are very grateful for their contribution, as well as many other contributors that brought this application to fruition. You know, this was applied in a very high-risk population that's Medicaid only, and for the U.S. that means for people who do not have have money, and many other contributors in order to provide the supplemental nutrients, some of the evaluations that were necessary. So we'd like to start by bringing us all back on board about developmental programming of health. And really, with the import will be emphasizing preconception health and how all the things that we know ahead of time, including those genetic vulnerabilities, gene variant vulnerabilities, will be emphasized today. We'll talk about the logic of why we chose those and how they optimize programs. We'll talk about the tools that they've now informed their use. And then we'll have a wonderful discussion about what actually happened and where do we think this is going to take us into the future. So just wrapping back around on developmental programming of health disease, I think before in medicine, we thought, boy, we're born with a certain way of being and there's nothing we can do about it. Well, developmental programming of health and disease blew the top off of that concept entirely. And it also meaning that there are many places, fulcrums within which throughout the life cycle that we can act. One of the most powerful is in the preconception and conceptional, post-conceptional time period. We find that health projecting into the future is related to 4 pregnancy-related outcomes and neonatal outcomes, but it predicts a great deal of our vulnerabilities in terms of non-communicable diseases, the chronic diseases. So we'll move to that next slide. And they are closely linked. Of course, it's not just the gene variants, but those gene variants set the stage. They set the stage for what's going to happen when we do have environmental exposures, when we do have sedentary lifestyles, when we are at different stages of our life cycle, when our nutrition might not be what it could be, or there's an opportunity to turn this around to optimize our diet, optimize our stress management, optimize our chemical exposures. And we find that if we do that, particularly in the preconception time period, we are able to optimize our outcomes when we're 65 to 105 and beyond. So there are particular birth outcomes that we're targeting in this particular application, and that is preterm birth and small for gestational age. And you can see from this slide that they are distinctly associated with all the things that plague our globe and are increasingly nearing epidemic proportions. Coronary vascular disease. You can see that being small for gestational age predicts who is going to have trouble with their cognition as a child, but also increases their rates of dementia as an adult. Other birth outcomes, such as large for gestational age, are increased when people start with a maternal obesity, which is going to be 85% of our population by 2030. And those ones end up with these asthma, diabetes, elevated risk of BMI. And now we know that if people gain too much weight during pregnancy as well, that their risk, their all-cause morbidity is higher as well. Being too stressed, having scores, ACEs scores, maybe you're aware of these ones. These ones are the ones that tell you how many bad events happen to you in childhood. And if you're greater than 4, then greater than 5, you have all these increased risks listed for you there. 60% of the US has greater than 4. So it's a ripe field for optimization. So let's go right into those gene variants. So how did we select these? Well, we knew we wanted to reduce the rates of preterm birth, large and small for gestational age, and being too stressed. So, as well as another one called preeclampsia. And so we went about the process of figuring out which gene variants, which single nucleotide polymorphisms were associated with those particular outcomes. And then we looked at whether they were something that we could, what the frequency was in the population, how well we could intervene with simple, doable interventions, lifestyle and diet. And then lo and behold, as we put this group together, we realized there was enormous overlap in their outcomes, so that people had overlapping compounding vulnerabilities. Think of it as vulnerabilities, but then flip the plate on that and recognize that they're also overlapping opportunities for intervention. So if we take a look at the top, preterm birth there, PR stands for the progen receptor gene, SNP. VDR in the middle, the overlapping of the pink and blue, is the vitamin D receptor variant, several of them. CYP1A1, where it is overlapping the blue and that kind of mauve color in the in phase 1 detoxification, and ApoE2, those overlaps that have to do with cardiovascular risk. So notice that not only are these genes, the three, particularly VDR and CYP1A1 and ApoE2, they're all related. It's preterm birth, but it's also swing around. It's large for gestational age. It's gestational diabetes. Swing around to the left is also small for gestational age. It's also overlapping with gestational hypertension or preeclampsia down in the other corner. So if we can figure out what those key nutrients and lifestyle interventions are, we get several benefits overlapping at once. So we can move to the next slide. So those common nutrients are remarkably redundant. You know, and this is, not only do they affect these particular nutrients, not only do they affect the gene variants, the hidden other piece that we're not even addressing here is, what do they do to the chromatin restructuring, the histone modification, you know, the mTOR system, all these other things, the microRNA, all of these also remarkably have an incredible amount of overlap with these particular nutrients as well. And so it gives us an opportunity to focus our nutrition and lifestyle recommendations. Now, layer on top of that, those particular, let's go back to those deficiency. Yeah. So layer on top of that, those particular micronutrients then are also going to be particularly important to identify whether one is deficient. And as it turns out through our research and clinical practice, we recognize that they are far more common than previously recognized, a reflection probably of our standard American diet. But that has been globalized, right? So what happens if you have vitamin D deficiency? Well, increased risk of diabetes. In that F1 generation, their risk of diabetes or being too large for gestational age. Carnitine, you can read these all, but they overlap remarkably. And if we can address these micronutrients, if we know about them, we can address them with simple interventions. So the other piece of this that needs to be linked up for all of us, when we're looking at these gene variants, what is the impact about these? Yes, if that MTHFR, let's go to the far left of your screen. And that MTHFR, the methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase, the C677T particularly, in the mom by herself, unpregnant, predicts that she's going to have an increased risk, not that she's going to have it, but she's going to have an increased risk of recurrent miscarriage, preeclampsia, and small for gestational age. But then let's layer in that, let's flavor that with the baby. What happens if, what does it predict in the presence of the baby? Well, that baby's going to be, if she is MTHFR, that baby is more likely to be so. And in the baby, the risk for that baby is neural tube defects, autism spectrum disorder, Down syndrome, vascular dementia, type 2 diabetes, and even talks about male infertility here. So that's how to read these. Go across the helix there and go down below and see all of the impacts. If we recognize these in the mothers, we also have a remarkable impact into that F1 generation. And for many of these, we also have an impact into the F2, F3, meaning the next generation and the next generation. So next, let's give an example of that. So the presence of 5-MTHF C677T, a homozygous or compound heterozygous, and the presence of a B12 transporter protein, transcobalamin 2. Those if we meet those methylation needs in the preconception time period, we will have fewer miscarriages and fewer neural tube defects. Let's do another example. If we have let's do this example. We can go on. This is just another example of that same idea that if we know this ahead of time, we know B12 is going to be something that we need to address. Also important to note is that if we address that, our homocysteine levels, which are probably what is the mechanism for early miscarriages and repeated miscarriages, is embryotoxic. And if we give that B12 ahead of time, we can reduce those rates. So let's go on into another example of how the interaction between mother and babe genetic variants will be. We know that let's give an idea of methylation in the preconception time period. So they compared mom and baby outcomes in mothers who did receive methylation and did not receive methylation, meaning folic acid in their preconception and and conception time period. And if those mothers had MTHFR and catecholamine O-methyltransferase and cystathionine beta synthase, and then the next slide will show us that if the baby also, and so if the mother had MTHFR and did not have enough methylation to begin with, her odds ratio of that baby having autism was 4.5 times that of somebody who did have methylation in the preconception time period. If she also had CBS, her odds ratio was 2.6. And if the mother had those two genes and the baby had COMT, the odds ratio drove right up to 7 times higher likelihood of having autism that could have been obviated by just giving methylation factors at the beginning, in the preconception time period. Very powerful stuff.
Wouldn't you say that this was for us kind of a flagstone study to start addressing, or really looking for these single SNPs, trying to decide if these single SNPs were powerful enough to do predictive evaluation and interpretation and thus intervention? And so Growbaby really started with, actually, I would say, the beginning of looking into what are these genotype associations to phenotypes. And I think this is a particularly powerful study. So if you've not read this 2011 study, I realize it's old, but this is really what sparked the genesis of us saying we need to look further here.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. Great comment. Yeah, and also emphasize to us that if what the purpose of this cycle is regenerating methyl groups, then why can't, if we know that ahead of time, we can intervene at various stages throughout this remarkable centrally located necessary function that drives a great deal of metabolism throughout your body. It's a real opportunity. Another example, let's kind of going back, you have to think back to one of the gene variants that we have recognized have increasing import, and is an example in terms of how we optimize, how do we customize a nutrition and lifestyle intervention, happens to be this particular gene variant, MTNR1B. It predicts increased risk for diabetes. But what we have found, maybe I should let you talk about this, Em. What do you think?
Go ahead and finish what you were going to say, and then I'll jump.
Okay. Well, fact is that so what we've found is that it's not just enough to know that this MTNR1B increases your risk of diabetes, and thus we make recommendations for low glycemic diets, for example, for Mediterranean diets. But it also turns out that disrupting your circadian rhythm that is more prominent in these particular this particular gene variants, then that also has an effect on your risk for diabetes. So and also the timing of your food consumption. It's not just what you're eating, but the timing of it that becomes very important. It depends on how well you sleep and how well your melatonin is secreted. That influences diabetes. Think of these as vulnerabilities, but then shift it to opportunities. We can make some very targeted recommendations if we know what these gene variants are.
So I think where I want to jump in here is to back up a little bit and understand that this MTNR1B has it really is a receptivity gene for the expression of melatonin, or the receptivity of these three different types of receptors: MT1, MT2, MT3, depending on where those receptor cell types are in the body. And in this case, if we step back a little bit, and I know we are all starting to understand that circadian rhythm, chrononutrition, our light and dark sleep cycles can be highly disrupted based on many, many factors. But melatonin secretion, secreted from the pineal gland, regulated by the hypothalamus throughout the course of the evening, of course, is going to be predicated on how much on the season. It's an environmentally influenced hormone, right? We understand that it's light receptivity, and the exposure of that natural sunlight during the day, and then the exposure of the blue light during the nighttime. But it's also seasonally driven. It's going to be driven by sex at birth. It's going to be driven by body weight, and I think that and age. And so I think that it's important to understand that when we're talking about what melatonin is doing in the body and how our genes interact with melatonin, and do they have an association with insulin secretion and sensitivity and glucose, we also have to understand that, just like what Leslie was elucidating earlier, it may not be one intervention, one product, one nutrient. It's going to be the cascading effect of how these systems interact with each other. I think that first, I want to make that statement, because melatonin, I think, might be one of the most powerful antioxidant hormones that we can utilize in the course of our and try to optimize in the course of our life cycle. And although what is appearing to be the most sensitive gene for the prediction of GDM, or the vulnerability of the prediction for GDM, is this MTNR1B gene. And so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about a couple of the different studies, but I also want to say this first, is that this is definitely not a this or that situation. This is if I have MTNR1B, which, by the way, in about 50% of the Caucasian population is present. So, if the Caucasian folks of the world count off by, 2, we have quite a few people walking around with an increased vulnerability of decreased insulin sensitivity and glucose dysregulation, depending on the timing of when they eat, how much melatonin is secreted at night, etc. And so I think, if I step back a little bit, I just want to say, this doesn't mean that if you present with MTNR1B that you should never take melatonin again in your life. It actually, interestingly enough, depending on the timing of melatonin intake, but particularly depending on the timing of eating, this appears to have the most influence over the expression or over the sensitivity of insulin and glucose dysregulation in the morning. So this actually, for me, falls back into the control of a lifestyle conversation, rather than a remove melatonin, never take it again, expose yourself to blue light all the time so melatonin doesn't secrete. No, that's not what we're saying here. But I do think that it's really important to say that this is an extraordinarily sensitive gene to the prediction of GDM particularly. It is still sensitive for predictive values in and around type 2 diabetes, but as you can see, is an 8.9-fold increased risk of type 2 diabetes in mothers who have this MTNR1B gene. And so I think Leslie and I, when we started looking into this, went, wow, this could really be something here, because this then, for us, reminds us what allows sensitivity of the islet cells in our pancreas to function. It's protein. What allows those things, what allows insulin to be more sensitive? It's fiber, it's the protein, it's the bacteria in our gut, it's the volume of food that we're eating. It's remembering that we need to eat smaller meals later. It reminds us that lifestyle is a key modifying factor of whether or not this conferred increased risk actually expresses. And so again, it's an opportunity, as Leslie was describing. I do think that these modulating effects make a difference. Leslie's talked at the very beginning about our changing body composition, and I'm very sensitive to this conversation because within pregnancy, this is a hard conversation to have, because a lot of folks are coming into pregnancy without ideal optimal body composition, not necessarily associated with weight, but composition. And I think that that's an important distinguishing factor too, because weight doesn't tell us everything, right? It's also what's going on with our active tissue mass and our fat mass and our skeletal muscle mass and our bone density. And truly, we have to take those factors into consideration too, and the cultural BMI indicators as well, where we know that depending on our ethnicity, that BMI scale is going to change. So this is not just BMI here for us. This is also, what is the body composition doing? How is the ratio of that occurring in the body? Is it adiposity occurring centrally? Is it occurring down further, on your hips and your bottom and your thighs? That's a different type of fat. That's a different type of metabolic dysregulation. And so this maternal adiposity conversation, I think we could have a whole entire podcast about this, and Catherine alone, because the influence of adiposity on MTNR1B is also really important and powerful, but we have to talk about the composition. But we also know that, these high affinity melatonin receptors also occur within the placenta and express within the placenta. So how is MTNR1B expressing in the placenta? How are those receptors, MT2, expressing, overexpressing? But then what are the other preconception strategies that we can go after to help improve the way that our insulin and glucose regulate within the course of the day? This gets back to my kind of chrononutrition conversation. So this was done in a non-pregnant population, but it was basically taking folks who had MTNR1B and folks who did not, and changing their meal timing. So giving them a big breakfast and a small dinner, giving them a large dinner and a small breakfast. And those who had MTNR1B but ate bigger earlier and smaller later had a 50% rate in weight reduction over the folks who had MTNR1B who ate late and then ate small in the morning. Right. So this is chrononutrition. This is what we're talking about. This isn't a necessarily never take melatonin again, because similarly, in studies, when researchers were looking at improving insulin sensitivity, improving glucose regulation, actually small dose melatonin for up to 8 weeks conferred benefit, even in MTNR1B for folks who presented with MTNR1B. So this is definitely and maybe it's so nuanced that it's going to drive us nuts, but I don't think it's nuanced enough for us not to pay attention, because I do believe melatonin still will play a phenomenal antioxidant role in preconception, even if you have, and even within pregnancy, because we know that melatonin rises naturally over the course of pregnancy, peaking at labor, creating more sensitivity to oxytocin. It's actually this really beautiful balance that occurs. And then that balance really long-term for newborn response is really beneficial too. And so this comes down to, if we know we have MTNR1B, how do we have the conversation with the mom to not eat too close to bedtime so that we can have better insulin regulation and glucose in the morning? So it is going to impact our fasting blood sugar levels. So that means, what do we eat at night? What's the volume? So it allows us to really target our intervention and our advice, because this gene is presenting so frequently, and it confers this increased vulnerability, yet we have the tools to be able to address it. Sorry, Leslie, that was much longer than a couple minutes, but
yes, but it's an inspiring moment, and it gives the people a threshold to cross into real optimization opportunities, and how nuanced they can be, but keep them doable. They are doable. They are so doable. So this was just a move on slide to say that there are other preconceptions, going back to it though, preconceptions strategies that that are optimizable as well. It does make a difference what the structure, the makeup of your microbiome is, and there is great evidence to show that you can manipulate that as well. Oxidative, and the important take home for this slide particularly is that it is the interaction, the effect of the microbiome is one of the influences of oxidative stress, and that microbiome and oxidative stress totally impacts whether your immune system is optimized even in utero and in that first year of life. We find that the other take home with this slide is that if we get our microbiome into a preconceptional tolerogenic dominant state, then that baby is born into a very tolerogenic, low activation immune system. And that is exactly what they need, that baby needs to develop a normal, later, beautifully functioning, not over-functioning, not hypersensitive, not autoimmune system as an adult. So what's the purpose behind why we're talking to you today? We're all on the same page. We're finding that using these techniques, knowing people's, targeting their systems and their system vulnerabilities and putting it all together, including those gene variants, which do make up something like, what is that number, Emily? 85% of our genetic variation is not in these major chromosomal defects. It is in these gene variants. This is where the power lies with this. It is common. It's part of us all. So, and ultimately, we are here to, we're going to reverse those maternal and neonatal adverse outcomes, which, and we're targeting the populations at greatest risk who have the most to gain. You know, think about those, the socioeconomic, ethnic, underrepresented, undertreated individuals. Where this ultimately will reduce the medical economic impact, and we're going to be building resilience for the globe. So what did our program look like? Do you want to go for that, Em?
Yes, and I'll be fairly brief because I do believe that a lot of the audience might be familiar, but let's go through it really quickly. So yes. This is a clinical application program that Leslie and I co-founded. We applied in 2010. In our own clinical study with our own N of 110, we found that we were able to remarkably reduce these major phenotypes that we know predict short and long-term health consequences over the lifespan, generationally and transgenerationally as well. And so what we were able to do was apply it over the course of 13 years within our own clinical setting, but then expand it within this Medicaid study. And that's where I kind of want to emphasize our work, because the application of it changed just slightly, and in many ways changed to, I believe, maybe more of an optimal way to interact in a global way, because it allows us through text-based interfacing, virtual nutrition visits, to really make an impact and still have the impact. But it did include very highly targeted, high-quality nutrients that we anticipated and have anticipated over the course of this decade that are needed in higher levels over the course of pregnancy. This is the unique biomarker nutrient assessments that go along with what is called global insurance, which are those labs that would be covered under the insurance setting when somebody is pregnant in the United States. But then additional send-out testing that came from OmegaQuant, and of course, our dnalife Growbaby Genomics. The integration and education tools did include some education in and around provider training, because the providers did have to allow us access to not only draw labs, but to help intervene on the labs and review the lab results. This is a table that we utilized, and this is a summary table of the nutrition intervention. Please note that I gave a big green circle up at the top, because from about 2010 to 2013, when we were applying this initially, we were using standard of care protein requirements within pregnancy. Since then, research has caught up, and we understand that this is woefully not adequate. So since that point, I just want to say we now address protein needs based on more of the 1.2 grams per kilogram to 1.5 grams per kilogram, hitting a minimum threshold of 75 grams per day from the get-go. not making it less in the first trimester, but really emphasizing protein. Because going back to that protein, so many of our processes are synthesized from adequacy of dietary protein. I also think it's important to say that this can occur in an omnivore, vegetarian, or a vegan setting. There are ways to optimize every single one of those dietary approaches, but please know that women have gone through this. Pregnant folks have gone through this with me and Leslie that have been omnivore all the way to vegan and have had healthy babies and healthy results. Okay. We capitalize on the fact that we understand every one of these trimesters is extraordinarily unique, not only for gestational development, particularly within, as we understand cellular differentiation, proliferation, and then of course the continuation of that over the course of gestation, but also the developmental needs of the mom. Because as Leslie says, you both have to survive this. This is not just about the baby. It is very, very difficult to convince a mother to eat this way if she's having restless legs, interrupting her sleep, she's constipated in the morning, she has headaches all day. It's just very difficult to want to eat a smoothie and to wake up and say, I'm going to eat well today. Because we know as humans who are not pregnant, that our day really starts the night before. So it's also predicated on how we sleep. So we really have to understand that it's not just, are we addressing nutrient needs to optimize the health of the baby, but are we addressing the function, the physical, emotional, and mental and spiritual function of the mom who is carrying this baby? Crucially important, but also important to give dietary nutrition recommendations based on what is available to people. I have found that over the course of this decade, empowerment is predicated first and foremost on whether or not it's accessible to a person. So it doesn't matter how much we know. I actually, in many ways, I have said this, that a patient's wisdom is far more important than my knowledge. And it will always be, because it does not matter how much I know, how much I feel like I can impart. If they cannot implement it, if it is not in concordant with their intuition about what is right for them, it's not going to happen. And so this is part of the reason why I love utilizing food as an entrance point and utilizing these core food plans, which are tailored by trimester to each woman. The foods that are in bold are foods that we know are highest in nutrient density associated with those cofactor nutrients that help optimize nutrigenomic expression, the availability, and the development of what's occurring and required for each of the moms and babies during this time. But this is what you'll notice is a modified Mediterranean low glycemic index diet, and this is highly, highly personalized. So we utilize basal metabolic rate, activity factor adjustment, age, weight, yes, gestational weight gain, preconception BMI. If I have a BIA, I will utilize it because I'll understand body composition a little bit more, but also age, and then how many babies that mother is carrying. And so this is all highly tailored. You'll also notice that going back into the toxic conversation, because we know that oxidative stress, toxins, detoxification, biotransformations, a big part in chemical exposure is a big part of the quality of our lives and the quality of the food that we eat. And so we do integrate, foods that we understand to be highest in pesticide, herbicide, fungicide residue, and those that tend to be grown with less exposure. And so in terms of optimizing availability of resources, utilizing things like WIC and SNAP, which are government benefits given to moms and families who need nutrition assistance. We cover those things, and we say, okay, if you're going to buy these conventionally, or if you're going to buy, then this is how we would prepare them at home prior to eating them. This is how you would eat canned and frozen food. This is, because we never want to exclude someone based on the resources that are available to them, because there are still ways to optimize health, even if we're discussing and considering socioeconomic resources. The protocols that we utilize and that we've utilized over the course of our program do try to specifically address babies born too small, too early, too large, okay? Because we know, again, that these results in increased vulnerability. Whether or not those express in vulnerability is different, as we know, over the course of our life. Our environment is highly influenced and modified, but it does, we call it a vulnerability set point. These results certainly indicate a vulnerability health set point for a child and a mother, like as in the case of GDM. The increased rates of diabetes or metabolic syndrome and particularly in mothers and women, we know that metabolic syndrome first presents for women with high hypertension, high glucose, so hyperglycemia, and elevated triglycerides. So it's also one of those things that in biomarker analysis within preconception and pregnancy, that those are things that we look for too. And I know that the lipid panel for a lot of people should be thrown out the window, but I still think that if we can pull small, simple indicators that are accessible to people without going into a massive lipid evaluation, we still find that there's utility in single spot biomarkers, because it opens the door for a larger conversation. But going back into these protocols, there's protocols for every single one of the interventions that we're discussing. So let's see what happened. This is one of my favorite pictures. So in our own results, so Leslie, you and I can go back and forth here, but I do want to say that within our initial clinical population, it was primarily Caucasian with some Latina, 50% Medicaid, meaning, again, it's a socioeconomic threshold of earnings over the course of the year, and whether or not somebody could qualify for assisted insurance coverage. In this population, this is a 100% Medicaid population, and a highly, highly diverse population as well. And when compared to the rest of the nation, the United States in this case, we actually had more diversity within our clinical population than otherwise is generalized over the course of those folks using and utilizing Medicaid resources. And 73% of our pregnancies were high risk. So I say this because I think this is important. Oftentimes we always wonder about bias. We wonder about if the volunteers, we specifically chose them. We didn't. This was certainly, we hope one day that this will be offered to every single pregnant person, no matter who they are and where they are. But for those volunteering and coming in, we had a diverse group and they were high risk. Our compliance findings, this was interesting. So we actually initially started off trying to implement Growbaby Oregon into Growbaby Nevada in the same way, utilizing group medical visits. Nutrition visits were far more frequent, but then COVID hit. And we had to figure out how to get this information to women in an accessible way that made them feel like they could apply it. And so what we realized very, very quickly is that cell phones are fairly powerful things, as we know. And so we utilized first a phone. Well, we tried to do Zoom. No one showed up. And then I started calling people. And then we started texting people. So it was the combination between phone and text that allowed for these compliance findings to really present as well as they did. So notice that the nutrient intake, that high quality nutrient intake, was about 80%. So, this happened 3 to 4 times a week. The food questionnaires. So this had to do with, are you eating protein at every meal? Are you eating a diverse array of colors? Are you drinking sugar sweetened beverages? Are you eating more than 3 times a day? Simple questions, but it really allowed us to kind of hone in on tailoring their nutrition needs in a simple way, but a powerful way. And so just based on whether or not there was protein adequacy, phytonutrient adequacy, frequency of eating, timing of eating, and then decreasing sugar sweetened beverages, increasing clear fluids, that gave us a very, very good baseline of foundation. And so by the end of it, we had extraordinary compliance actually in and around food intake, which I have to say that the most powerful, the question that got answered the most as a yes, and I wish it was answered no, was sugar sweetened beverages. Sugar was a big pull, a big power for this group. But then every single woman got their personalized and individualized food plan as well, and they applied it extraordinarily well in the way that they could. So again, this came back to emphasizing the foods that we know that we need to emphasize based on trimester for gestational development. But we spent a lot of time via text. I sent the funniest videos of me doing, squats when I was brushing my teeth, showing people how to do pelvic holds, showing people how to stretch safely. So this was, and I believe that it was, and Leslie and I believe that it is the human connection between somebody who cares a lot and somebody who may not realize they need a little bit more help, or realize they need help and don't have the resource, that I believe creates the tether between the ability to implement and feel empowered. And so this is what we hope to scale. But these nutrient deficiencies, I think this shocks me every time, and probably Leslie too, that it wasn't like we created optimal nutrient levels across pregnancy. In fact, we didn't. We had massive deficiency still, which is not physiologically uncommon for pregnancy. Yet the difference here is we provided the resource when the body needed it. And this is kind of falling back into the conversation around the Bruce Ames triage theory, which is if your body has the resource available to triage a situation, good, bad, acute, chronic, indifferent, that it will utilize it and prioritize it in a way that it's truly needed, even if it means that we don't reach balance across all systems. And I think Leslie and I both are ever convinced that it's maybe not necessarily that we have to reach maternal serum sufficiency in these nutrients, but we have to give the resource, because those resources are expressing on these genomic pathways in a way that are protecting against an adverse event. Because if you see that we had high risk pregnancies and you see the deficiencies, you would say, well, yes, that population is just going to have preterm birth, preeclampsia, GDM, they're going to be all over the place, but they weren't.
Can I back you up one point? I wanted to note, as we go forward from this, how that vitamin D 100% deficiency, I think that some of these gene variants might explain that as we go along. I just wanted to point that out.
Yes, please. And then I probably didn't take a breath while I talked the whole time.
So now go right on to that next example. And there in the center is that VDR being very, very prominent, meaning that the vitamin D receptor also a variance in it, its ability to receive and utilize vitamin D are high. In our population, it was most of them, remarkably so. And then look at each side of this slide. The overlap, the progen and the VDR overlap with increased risk for preterm birth and small for gestational age.
And I want to just really quickly, MTHFR, I think, gets a lot of press, so to speak. But remember too that the DHFR gene is also a part of folic acid conversion, right? And so it's not just going to be, is somebody presenting with MTHFR? It's also going to be, what are the steps prior to taking that, the truly active form that our bodies can use and metabolizing it away from folic acid. That doesn't really happen in MTHFR. That happens in a few steps prior, which is DHFR. And so this is also has to do, we are going to learn more and more about what's happening with kind of peripheral circulating folic acid levels and the role that DHFR has in that, and MTHFR. So I think sometimes when we pull specific genes, particularly those that have a lot of press, I have to be careful with this even on my MTNR1B, because it's like, well, this is a highly predictive gene. I think we need to remember this all works in a system. There's steps of conversion that happen prior to that. There's adequacy of nutrients that influence whether or not this expresses, so, and then the intake, like as in the case with folic acid, it was fortified in the United States in 1996, mandated in 1998, and that DHFR gene plays a big role in that, whether or not we have elevated peripheral levels and what that, the peripheral levels are doing in our body. So I just want to say that too.
Yeah.
So the results.
You go.
The results, I think here, again, they surprised us in this way. The melatonin receptor presented kind of epidemiologically appropriately, at least within the Caucasian population. But you saw that we had a really, actually, in our own population, it was that the Caucasian demographic was actually quite low. But I think more than anything, Leslie started saying this, in vitamin D metabolism, we had 100% nutrient deficiency And we had a phenomenally high level of BDR polymorphisms. And yet we didn't have the preterm birth. We didn't have, we had some GDM. We had some of the results that you would otherwise associate with vitamin D deficiency, but we didn't have many. And so, Leslie, do you want to say anything else about this?
Just that how much better if we could know this information before anybody got pregnant, because we would be able to optimize then and minimize, just optimize. And I say minimize vulnerability, but optimize health. Really, that's what it is. Optimize this.
And to speak here, this really is a zinc transporter. So on insulin secretion, for some people, this confers risk, and for some people, this confers benefit. So I'm excited. We are working actually with Helen and Catherine and Chris, the dnalife team, on a version 2.0 of the dnalife Growbaby test, where we will take into consideration patient demographic, patient questionnaire intake, the SNP results, and then attaching them to biomarker analyses that would give us a better indication about, are we genetically expressing vulnerability within our biomarkers? Do we need to do something about that? And so I think, this version 2.0 is really going to be 3 legs of the stool, taking into consideration more patient data, more patient intake and questionnaire, really analyzing the genotype, the SNP results, and then attaching them to biomarkers that help us track the actuality of the function and change of function and the expression of these pathways in our body. Outcomes to date. Leslie, go for it.
Yeah. So these are remarkable pieces of data. The usual to use. So in our small group, nonetheless small, but high risk and ethnically, socioeconomically at risk, we had no preterm births. Average rate is 10 to 15% in the US. Small, and in some populations, primarily Black populations, it can be as high as 22%, meaning 1 out of every 5 babies is preterm. Small for gestational age, none. Preeclampsia, none. We had 1 episode of gestational diabetes, and 1 large for gestational age. That large for gestational age is probably what's called constitutional, related to the size of the babies that this mother just has, because her other babies were of this similar size. There was only 1 cesarean. It happened to be a repeat elective, and that means typically a primary cesarean section rate is more like anywhere from 14 to 30% in the US, and we had no primary cesareans. And breastfeeding, comparing that to the Nevada initial data, it looks like maybe 80% of the population, as high as 80% of the population, might start breastfeeding, but we had a nice 93%, much higher.
So,
and yeah, you go ahead, Em.
No, so I think it's hard to come back to money here, because the benefits that we can see across the lifespan are huge, and I feel like we could all say, well, just based on the health benefits alone, we should be doing this, but the world runs in a capitalistic way, and so I think it's important to also draw really clear distinction around what would happen if we were able to implement this type of care across, and just let's use the state of Nevada in this case. And so if an average preterm birth in the state of Nevada costs $65,000, that's a lot of money. We also know that over the course of the first 6 months of age, the increased cost of a preterm birth over a birth of born at term is going to be on average $10,000 to $15,000 more over the first 6 months, let alone, if we step back, let alone what's happening to the mental, emotional, physical well-being of the parents who are also caring for this child, right? That's an inexplicable cost. I mean, I just, and for those who have had exposure to a preterm birth, or who are a parent or a caregiver or a it doesn't matter, you could feel that the intensity of that is difficult too. But let's say that we apply this across just the state of Nevada. We're looking at $144 million in terms of savings at birth if we were to apply this versus the current cost of birth that's happening right now of a preterm birth in the state of Nevada. And these are preterm birth numbers alone on cost savings. This doesn't include the cost savings associated with small for gestational age, large for gestational age, GDM, preeclampsia, and again, the complications and increased risk that occur when those phenotypes or those morbidities present. So, there's an opportunity here also from a financial side to really unburden the medical system, the insurance system, and really would allow us to maybe potentially convince insurance companies, policymakers that preventative medicine, preventative dollars is the only way forward. And this is how you would measure it. Because people, how do you measure prevention? Well, this is one way. This is a way you measure prevention. And it's one that I think cannot be overlooked or overstated enough.
And think of the incredible improvement in the life of that individual and their productivity, their well-being, their cognition, their resilience. All of these things are going to make such a difference, yes, monetarily, and the people who are at the greatest risk for morbidities get the best gain.
That's right. So we believe that if we can access people through a phone, through text, and they know who you are and they know that you care about you, they will respond. And I think that might be, maybe if there are any psychologists or access to psychologists, they could probably elucidate this for us a little bit more. But we know that connection is so critical. It can't be something that feels impersonal. It has to be somebody that understands, that knows your name, that knows that you are trying to juggle 4 other kids and get to the bus station when it's 102 degrees outside. How do I do that safely? It's somebody that helps try to solve problems for you. It's somebody that you can text and say, I'm in the grocery store aisle. What do I do right now? Or I have 2 types of vitamin D in my hand. Which one should I take? And it's that access to somebody who cares and somebody who can direct that personalization of care that allows somebody to respond the way that they do. There is satisfaction overall. These moms felt less stressed, felt more supported, felt more empowered. Our deficiency rates within this population were sky high, yet there was not the expression of these phenotypes and morbidities. Again, we believe that this is probably based on the foundational concepts of the triage theory, but also access to the resources of these nutrients and what the benefit that they have over the nutrigenomic, the epigenomic expression of our beings. And then, of course, having this information prior to pregnancy is going to be the most optimal time to draw these labs and to draw this genomic panel. And what I think was so wonderful about our population too is that there was some hesitancy about the word genomics. And so there was some time that we had to spend with these moms over what this was actually looking at. And that when they were able to understand that this genomic information was going to be the modifiable kind, not the chromosomal abnormalities that we can't do anything about, but the type that are fully within the locus of their control and really provide a roadmap for the rest of their life. I mean, it was like a light bulb went off in these moms. So I think the way that we have this conversation around the DNAlife Growbaby test is really important too, that this is not just information for preconception and pregnancy. This is going to be information and in some ways a little insight into what's going on with your child too. Maybe a little bit more understanding about what's going on with you, or maybe what has been going on with your mom and your grandparents. Like, oh, this all of a sudden makes a bunch of sense. So you start to see the transgenerational effect just even in and around the DNAlife Growbaby Genomic test. This risk is not hardwired. That is the most important takeaway today. Knowing the information is crucial though, because we can do something about it. And I think that's been part of for Leslie and I, such a powerful relationship with DNAlife and Growbaby, is that we're in pursuit of providing answers, understanding, patience, and maybe grace for ourselves in having this information.
What's next?
So we're going to work. Leslie, go ahead. take it away.
As Emily had said, we're going to be working on Growbaby and DNAlife 2.0. We are going to adjust our nutrigenomic testing as a result, with the addition of a patient questionnaire and biomarker analysis. We're hoping, and this includes you all too, that we'll expand this new concept of personalized evaluation and individuation of a person's health, as well as their interventions, into managed care organizations. Those are the ones that provide for the people who do not have any other means of insurance for health. Private insurers, direct to consumer is a new market that will be emerging, and for you guys to be part of that as well. We're hoping that all of this, as in toto, will be a powerful nudge in pushing the government to change its policy on how we manage health, not just in the preconception and periconception time period, but across the lifespan. This is the way we need to do it, and we need all of you as partners. We can see that eventually we'd like to expand this into what is it that makes, what are the principal pieces that make this work? What are some of the mechanisms? That's for future interest for those of us who are minded in that way. But we're excited to and grateful for the opportunity to work with all of you, as well as the partners that made this project happen.
And there they are. Thank you, both of you, for this amazing presentation. So I heard this presentation in September in Seattle at the PLMI, and people stood up and clapped when you had spoken, Leslie, and because they were so impressed with what you have been able to demonstrate, and also the money that you can save if this was implemented properly in in hospitals and pregnancy clinics, etc. And Jeff Bland stood up on the stage and he said, like, Leslie Stones has just demonstrated, and of course this goes with Emily. You just weren't there, Emily. We missed you. But he stood up, and that was kind of where my hair on my arms kind of raised. And he said, Leslie, you have just demonstrated how prevention of disease and optimal health starts preconception. And so it was so clear the way he said it, and people were just like really amazed with the presentation and the outcomes that you have had. And so thank you for sharing this with all us here today as well. A few questions has come up. Afifa has been the active one today on the typing. I'll see if she puts in long text, so I'll see if I can get the gist from them. But the last one she just wrote was on vitamin A. She moved into vitamin D and protein as well. So firstly, she asked if any of these women were eating sufficient enough of meat. So those eating sufficient amount of meats, would they have normal iron levels? Did you see a pattern? Or?
No, and that's going to be kind of further analysis. This is our preliminary report, but then we will get to go down into exactly what these women were eating. But you'll see that the the iron deficiency was more down into the 17%, which actually in the BIPOC community is quite low. And so it suggests a couple things, that iron is a highlighted nutrient from the beginning, and it was for this population. So the OB providers highlighted iron intake very early, so I think that had a lot to do with it. But we did see improvement in protein intake over the course, for almost everybody, over the course of their entire pregnancy. So I'm sure there is going to be some association between dietary animal protein intake and iron. However, we know that non-heme iron sources and vitamin A and copper and B2, we know that there's other important cofactors in and around erythropoiesis and iron metabolism. And so I can't, I don't want to only point at iron because it, again, goes into a system. But yes, I think there probably will be.
Although, to give this a little bit of context as well, in standard obstetric practice, iron is the one thing that's tested They don't test those other micronutrients. And this practice, I think, was particularly on it in terms of making sure that they were using not just oral iron replacement, they were also using infusional iron. They were very, very aggressive, and I believe appropriately so. It has so much to do, iron, carnitine, cofactors to get that our energy metabolism working, the cytochrome system working like it's supposed to, generation of ATP and such. So in the mitochondria. So that's also the reason why it was not as high as I would have thought it would have been. And I do think that our protein consumption was probably more consistent with what is generally epidemiologically present.
Then there was a comment in regards to vitamin A and eyesight in the children. Have you reached any like low vitamin A and poor eyesight in the children?
In this, we did not study that, but yes, there is some association between maternal vitamin A availability in stores, but also and yes, and eyesight and retinal development and eye development. But that also falls into kind of the lutein and zeaxanthin to the carotenoids, and I think that it's to sidestep just slightly, I think it's important to also understand that vitamin A metabolism is predicated on a few things, but some of it is genomic expression of BCMO1, which we don't test. But that's our ability to kind of convert into that active vitamin A form. And, there are some folks that can't take carotenoids in and have it metabolize into provitamin A. And so we didn't study that directly in this study, but there is association between maternal vitamin A status and eye development, but particularly looking into the carotenoids and the influence of the carotenoids on eye development as well.
Recalling that these particular gene variant and these particular micronutrients were chosen to optimize the specific maternal and neonatal outcomes. We also know that, but we also think about in construction of these people all receive a prenatal pack that is aimed at optimization. It's already better than one of the pieces of this study is that that's what they get. Everybody gets a base prenatal vitamin that has been already optimized based on our known micronutrient insufficiencies, and then over top of that, we make sure that their nutritional program optimizes all those other nutrients that might have less genetic variant effect in terms of developmental programming, but the outcomes will be optimized.
Super. And then, not necessarily last but least, Afifa also brought up vitamin D, like a publications that looked into vitamin D and preterm birth. But there may not be any genes on it, and I don't know if you looked into that or.
No, there's definitely an association between vitamin D deficiency and preterm birth.
Vitamin E.
Oh, E, excuse me. No, I've not looked.
Okay, so I'll see if
I should say I have looked and I've not found an association between vitamin E and preterm birth.
I think there's some new data coming in and around fat soluble vitamins and preterm birth. So I think in the larger array of kind of A and D, E and K. So whoever asked that question, I am aware that research is occurring. But we will look into it more.
Super. Okay, well, I hope you all enjoyed this presentation. And thank you again to the both of you for a sterling one. And then, hopefully we'll get more updates as you trot along with your research and your practice and all the mothers and babies that you're working with. And to all you out there, thank you for listening in. And I, of course, hope that you wish to continue further educating yourself also in Growbaby. If it's not because you work with women who wants to conceive or who wants to become pregnant or who are pregnant, then at least you can always tell someone, yeah, that you meet, so we can spread the word that we can actually do a big difference in regards to lifestyle changes and modifications in regards to healthy babies and healthy life in those babies as well later on. To the two of you, thank you very much and enjoy your day. And everyone else, have a lovely time. Bye.
Very grateful. Bye.
Bye.
If you do not already have an account with us, please contact our team and we will assist you. If you found this webinar helpful, please like and subscribe to our channel.